By the mid-19th century of the Common Era, British colonisation in Australia had entered a phase defined less by visible conflict and more by institutional control. Open frontier violence had not disappeared, but it was no longer the primary mechanism of expansion. Instead, law, administration, and bureaucracy became the dominant tools through which colonial authority was consolidated. Land remained the central concern. From the 1820s onward, colonial governments faced a problem of legitimacy. Vast territories had been seized through violence, squatting, and informal occupation. To transform conquest into permanence, these outcomes had to be legalized. Surveying, mapping, and land registration became critical instruments of power. Surveyors were often the first representatives of the state to arrive in newly occupied regions. Armed with chains, compasses, and maps, they translated country into measurable units that could be owned, sold, and inherited. Rivers became boundaries. Plains became allotments. Sacred sites disappeared beneath coordinates. This transformation was not symbolic. Once mapped, land could be defended by law and force. The introduction of formal land legislation reinforced this process. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s of the Common Era, colonial authorities introduced systems of leases, licenses, and grants that retrospectively legalized squatting. Occupation that had been illegal became lawful. Violence that had cleared land was rendered invisible. Aboriginal dispossession was reframed as orderly settlement. Law did not restrain expansion. It stabilized it. At the same time, new systems of policing emerged to enforce colonial order. Mounted police units were established across New South Wales, Victoria, and later Queensland. Their purpose was not impartial law enforcement. They existed to protect settler interests, suppress Aboriginal resistance, and secure land already claimed. Patrols moved along frontier zones, responding to reports of resistance with swift and often lethal force. Aboriginal people remained excluded from legal protection. They could not testify against Europeans in court for much of the 19th century. This exclusion ensured that violence committed by settlers or police would almost never be prosecuted. The law functioned asymmetrically, offering protection to settlers while denying recognition to indigenous victims. Missions and reserves formed another layer of control. Presented as humanitarian institutions, missions aimed to remove Aboriginal people from contested land and place them under supervision. By the mid-19th century of the Common Era, Aboriginal populations in many regions were confined to reserves where movement, labor, and family life were regulated. These institutions replaced open warfare with containment. The language of protection masked coercion. On missions, Aboriginal people were discouraged or forbidden from practicing culture, speaking language, or maintaining traditional law. Children were separated from families in the name of education and discipline. Dependency was cultivated deliberately. Survival was permitted only within colonial structures. By the 1860s of the Common Era, British authority in Australia was no longer provisional. It was embedded in law, property, and governance. Frontier violence had created the conditions for colonisation. Institutions ensured its permanence. What had been seized through force was now defended through courts, police, and policy. Understanding this phase is essential. Colonisation did not end when violence subsided. It succeeded when control became normal. From the 1860s of the Common Era onward, British colonisation in Australia increasingly relied on governance rather than open force. Violence had prepared the ground, administration now secured it. Colonial governments sought to manage Aboriginal populations not as sovereign peoples, but as wards, subjects, and problems to be controlled. Protection laws became central to this system. Beginning in the 1860s and expanding through the late 19th century of the Common Era, colonies introduced legislation that placed Aboriginal people under state supervision. These laws varied by region but shared the same objective: to regulate movement, labor, residence, and family life. Under the language of protection, Aboriginal autonomy was dismantled. In Victoria, the Aborigines Protection Act of 1869 of the Common Era established a system of reserves governed by appointed boards. Aboriginal people were required to live on designated land, seek permission to travel, and submit to surveillance. Similar frameworks emerged in other colonies in subsequent decades. Control extended into everyday life. On reserves and missions, rations replaced access to country. Employment was restricted and wages were often withheld or controlled by administrators. Marriage required approval. Cultural practices were discouraged or banned outright. The aim was not coexistence, but transformation, reshaping Aboriginal people into compliant subjects within a colonial order. Children became a primary focus. By the late 19th century of the Common Era, colonial authorities increasingly targeted Aboriginal children for removal. Officials argued that separating children from their families would accelerate assimilation. Education and training were framed as benevolent interventions. In reality, these policies fractured communities and undermined cultural continuity. Policing reinforced administrative power. Mounted police and local constables enforced protection laws with authority to detain, remove, and punish. Resistance to these measures was met with arrest or forced relocation. While large-scale massacres declined in some regions, coercion remained constant. Violence had shifted from the frontier to the institution. Land control continued to expand through legal means. As reserves were established, their size and location reflected colonial priorities rather than Aboriginal needs. Fertile land was rarely allocated. Reserves were often situated on marginal ground, isolating communities from economic opportunity. Over time, even these limited lands were reduced or revoked as settler demand increased. By the 1880s and 1890s of the Common Era, colonization had achieved administrative dominance. Aboriginal people were no longer confronted primarily as enemies on a battlefield. They were managed through files, permits, and regulations. This form of control proved more durable than violence alone. It embedded dispossession within routine governance, making it appear normal and lawful. Understanding this period reveals a critical truth. Colonial power did not fade when guns fell silent. It adapted. Law replaced warfare. Bureaucracy replaced expeditions. Control persisted through systems that shaped daily life rather than dramatic confrontation. If this kind of careful, historically grounded analysis is valuable to you, following the channel helps ensure that these stories continue to be told with accuracy and depth. By the closing decades of the 19th century of the Common Era, British colonization in Australia had entered a phase of consolidation. The objective was no longer expansion into new territory, but the permanent entrenchment of control over land and people already claimed. What had been achieved through violence and law now had to be sustained across generations. This required institutional continuity. Colonial administrations refined systems of surveillance, record-keeping, and classification. Aboriginal people were registered, categorized, and monitored. Identity itself became subject to bureaucratic definition. Decisions about where individuals could live, work, or travel were determined not by community ties, but by officials empowered to regulate every aspect of life. Racial classification became a central tool. By the late 19th century of the Common Era, colonial authorities increasingly distinguished between full-blood and mixed-descent Aboriginal people. These categories had no basis in Aboriginal law or identity. They were imposed to justify differential treatment and to support the belief that Aboriginal societies would eventually disappear. Policy was shaped around managing decline rather than recognizing survival. Education and labor were harnessed to control. Aboriginal children placed in institutions were trained for domestic service or agricultural labor. Boys were prepared for manual work. Girls were prepared for servitude. Wages, when paid at all, were controlled by protectors. Economic dependency reinforced compliance, while the promise of assimilation masked exploitation. Christian missions played an ambiguous role. Some missionaries documented abuses and advocated for better conditions. Others enforced strict discipline and cultural suppression. Regardless of intention, missions functioned as instruments of confinement. They separated Aboriginal people from country, restricted movement, and undermined traditional authority. Spiritual conversion was inseparable from social control. By the time Australia approached federation at the end of the 19th century of the Common Era, the foundations of the modern state were firmly in place. In 1901 of the Common Era, the colonies federated to form the Commonwealth of Australia. Aboriginal people were excluded from the new nation's constitutional framework. They were not counted in the census. They were not recognized as citizens. The colonial order carried forward into the national one without interruption. This exclusion was not accidental. Federation marked the success of colonization, not its conclusion. The new nation inherited the structures built during the colonial period: land ownership patterns, legal exclusions, and systems of control. What had been imposed under imperial authority now operated under Australian governance. The consequences were long-lasting. By the early 20th century of the Common Era, Aboriginal people across Australia lived under regimes that regulated movement, labour, family life, and identity. Resistance continued, but it took new forms: petitioning, advocacy, and survival within hostile systems. The frontier had closed, but the struggle had not ended. Understanding this phase clarifies a critical point. British colonisation did not merely seize land. It created a system designed to endure. Violence cleared space. Law secured it. Administration maintained it. Each stage depended on the previous one, forming a continuous process rather than separate episodes. This is why colonisation cannot be understood as a distant event. It was embedded into institutions that shaped Australia well into the 20th century and beyond.